So we welcome all. This is the third workshop in a series of the 4 soul powers and the 12 qualities, or what we call living principles, represented by the mother's symbol and their application in everyday life. And some of you are joining us for the first time in this series, and so we will be taking time next week, next Sunday, to review in more detail the mother's symbol. And I think we have all four, just admit a few people here. We have all four instructors with us here today. So obviously Shadalu Ranade, who will be speaking today. He's joining from Pondicherry. We have Rashi Bunny, who is also one of our instructors, and I believe, Rashi, you're in Surat, India, but I know you travel quite a bit, so you may be in some other location. And of course, Vladimir and myself from La Grasse here in Fountain Inn, South Carolina. So again, Shardalu is going to be our first speaker in this series, and he'll address today understanding the true nature of power. Shardalu is a scientist, he's an educator and scholar residing at the Sri Aurobindo Ashram in Pondicherry, and he's influenced over 5,000 teachers throughout India through his immersive workshops on integral education, and has traveled all over the world in delivering lectures and conducting workshops on integral education, management by consciousness, esoteric sciences, integral yoga and spiritual practices, and more. So it's always an honor to have Shardalu with us. So with that, Shardalu, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Namaste. When we originally spoke of the theme for this discussion, there was a title given which was something about how to wield power or something like that, and I felt very uncomfortable because the whole concept is power exists to be wielded, whereas if we truly understand the nature of power, we recognize it is something far greater. And of course, we have a right and even a responsibility to wield it. But the understanding of the true nature would come first, and with it would come the capacity to rightly and effectively utilize it. So I'm going to start with this first question of kind of an exploration. What is the true nature of power? Our normal association with this word. So somebody is powerful because they are sitting on a chair which grants them the power, or because everybody obeys them or accepts them as a natural leader, and so the power is given to them. Something like that generally. But I'd like to explore with a few examples, and through those examples we will find that the true nature of power is something quite different. So let's take an example where somebody is a prime minister or a president, and automatically the person can sign a paper, make an executive order, give a command, and literally the whole country is run by these decisions made by the person. Or just take a general political figure who has this kind of a power, or somebody in a company, and we'll explore some examples like this. If you think about it, sometimes you find prime ministers or presidents, as we had in India once. Manmohan Singh was a technocrat. He was selected, not elected by people. He was selected by the party because it's a parliamentary system. People elect individuals who come to parliament, who then select somebody who will be prime minister, who may not be your choice at all. But that's the way the parliamentary system works. So we had Manmohan Singh. He was a good man perhaps, but utterly ineffective for the simple reason that he had zero charisma, zero ability to wield power, maybe good ideas or good intentions, but when it came to execution, nothing. He never drew natural respect from people, was never effective in any action, and pretty much his whole tenure, nothing useful happened. And what I want to point out here is, the person needs to have something which allows them to wield power and to be effective. Otherwise, you can be sitting on the chair and pretty much the chair rules you. The machinery that you are wielding controls you and decides what you need to do, and all you do is you sign on papers according to the demands of the machinery. The bureaucracy rules in this case, or the people. And in such cases, and we have other cases you will see perhaps right now in the United States, you have situations like that. I don't want to take names, but where you see the person in authority is almost like a puppet. Who wields the real power? It's not the person sitting on the chair. And therefore, I will conclude it's not the chair that gives you power. The actual power may be completely elsewhere. The chair is only a representative. The position of Prime Minister or President is only representative and perhaps a natural focal point for communication, but not necessarily the center of power. Let's take another example where children go to school. The school teacher has a power in the classroom. And I've often found this to be one of my daydreams. Each time you see the teacher says, "Sit down, keep quiet," the children become glum and sit. What if the children said, "No, we won't"? And if all the children said, "No, we won't," what will happen? What can the teacher do? And after a while, the teacher's voice will rise. They will speak louder, shout, as if trying to seize control by putting out more force with anger. And you see, anger is just an attempt to compensate for lack of real power. You're in a situation where you want to act, you're unable to exercise power, and you start getting angry as a way of amplifying your state of power and asserting yourself, but it's actually evidence of insufficiency of power. So the teacher will shout. Eventually, perhaps he or she will break down in tears or say, "I will call the principal." Meaning, the teacher doesn't have power, the power is someone else. Who will then come? Now let's take another situation where the principal comes and says, "Well, children, you have to keep quiet." And children said, "No, we won't. We will do what we like." What can the principal do? If it was a single child, they could say, "Okay, we will expel you." But if all the children in the whole school say, "No, we won't," you have a revolt. What can they do? And I've actually seen videos of vice chancellors of a university in the US literally begging the students because the students just decided, "No, we will not abide by your authority." Where is the real power in such a case? Think about it. Or I will extend it one more step. Parents telling children. When parents tell children, "Do this" or "Don't do that," children tend to obey. Up to a certain age, they may be rebellious initially, but they will still obey, unwillingly sometimes. But after a certain age, they begin to push back. And they begin to seize power to a point where they will make demands on the parents, and parents feel themselves helpless. And most of you have been through such experiences at some time or other. And again, the question is, how did parents have power before? At what point did it reverse? What was the real thing which reversed it? If you think about it, power is given in such cases. The children give power to parents or to the teachers. The teachers in a school give power to the principal by saying, "Yes, we accept to abide by this authority and obey this authority." And at any point, the collective could say, "Sorry, we are refusing to obey, and we take back the power that we gave you." Now, when you look at these examples in some depth, you recognize that power is nothing to do with a location or an authority or a position. It's actually something which everybody is giving or taking. And let's extend this to the largest space where in a whole country, the people say, "We refuse to abide by X." Prime Minister, President, even Constitution. What do? You launch the police first and then the military. And if the military says, "Sorry, we refuse to accept your authority," what happens then? You realize that in all these cases where we saw power associated with a position, it was given by the people, and the people would have the right to take it back. Would they? And now I'm going to take a very contrary In these cases, you see people have the power to take back the power they gave. But I will give you now two examples which are even the opposite of this. Napoleon had been arrested, he was jailed, and at some point he escapes. The king sends the entire army to seize Napoleon, arrest him, and put him back in jail. Napoleon is riding alone. Before him comes the army that is sent to seize him. The entire power is with the army. Napoleon speaks to them, convinces them that he is their true leader, and turns the entire army around and uses it to seize upon the king. The people who had the power in their hands, let's say in this case the army men, Napoleon alone had the power to seize the power back from them and wield it in a way that they accepted him once again. Think about what that means. And in all these examples, the one obvious conclusion is power is not something to do with physical positions, authorities, names, labels, etc. Not even appearance. Napoleon was not a very attractive looking person, by the way. He was short, he was fat, he had a loose stomach, he had a limp, but he wielded power, true power. And he could turn a situation just like that. Seize power from a people. An individual overwhelming everybody. Think about what that means. And that's where you get the first glimpse of the true nature of power. Now, I'm going to extend with one more example. In a typical power structure in a company, where you have an authority at the top, let's say a CEO and a board and a whole hierarchy. Typically, you will see in a building which is multi-storied, when it's a big company, the power is always right on top. No powerful person will accept to have an office under and put the people he wields on a higher floor. Think about why. Maybe he says, here's a building of 100 floors and I can take the 99th or 98th and have others working above me. He's not going to do it. Naturally, the person who's wielding the power would choose to be right on top and feel others as if subdued under him. Now, you must keep this in mind because this is symbolic and yet there's a truth to it. And then, when this CEO is now wielding power, he gives a command. He or she gives a command and then it's followed by a whole hierarchy, a machinery. But the people who have to execute can rebel, can compromise, can confuse, can distort even the commands, or may siphon off funds, may deliberately sabotage the implementation. And this person who's at the top should have the capacity to sense that and to correct that by asserting real power. If he cannot, then those under him have seized power. Now, I've actually been to places like this in companies. I've had, fortunately, occasions to be with some of the biggest names, some of the biggest industry heads, and interacted with them in their offices and outside their offices across, even including the world. And I've seen this very interesting thing. In cases where the person did not have real power, the machinery that they were wielding, the people who were supposed to obey them, were the ones who actually decided. These people were merely figureheads. In cases where the person wielded real power, he did not care, he did not depend on other people's capacity. If someone was ineffective, he could replace, but the real center of power was always visible. Those were the companies that were successful. The companies in which the person at the top did not have real power were the companies which tended to fizzle out, lose their success over time, and even eventually financially collapse. All you needed to do was to observe the nature of the power structure and the wielding, and you could know in which direction the company is going to go. And this is a fundamental difference between people who have inherited a company and people who have risen through the ranks and therefore have been trained and tested in their capacity to wield power. Often, in a business family, the children grow up and are trained and taught to wield power also, but not always, and not always effectively. And so often you see in 2 or 3 generations, if that transmission of the family values and the capacity to wield power is not there, then automatically the family lineage of the business begins to fizzle out, or the last patriarch or matriarch who wields the power has to make a structure by which they transfer power outside the family members. Everything boils down to the capacity to wield power. You have the capacity, you will be effective. You do not have, you will not be effective. And so now we come back to something very psychological in a sense. What is this capacity to wield power? And then what is the nature of the power that is so wielded? One thing we do see obviously, in those who wield power, they have a huge amount of vitality and energy. In fact, we may even say that somebody with a weak vitality cannot wield power effectively. You may have a strong body, you may have a strong mind, but if your vital energy is weak, you don't have the influence, the capacity to influence. And we may even make the provisional identification of vitality with power and say, if you have good vitality, you can wield it, you can wield power. But as we will see, that's not enough. That's only one side. And the best example I would give to counter this is, historically, the single greatest example in human history that we know of in recorded history is Joan of Arc. And here's a woman in an age when women did not fight, did not wield the sword, at least not in Europe. In India, we still had queens who were fighting, who were leaders, who went into battle with the baby on the back and defeated the enemy. But at least in Europe, in that age at least, you did not see women fighting or lifting a heavy sword. Here's a woman who is a villager with zero training of any kind for war, who goes up to the king, convinces the king that she is going to lead the army. This is real power. You walk into a situation where the entire society is set up against you, and you're able to convince the king. Seize power from the king, literally. And with that authority, she now leads an army. There is this extraordinary event where she is faced with the opposing army, alone rides up to the British army and says, I see a bloodbath. Turn back. And the entire British army turns around, obeys her. How do you explain this? A woman with no training, not strong enough perhaps even to wield a sword in a normal capacity perhaps, riding a horse, ordering an army to turn around. You do not see vital power, you do not see physical power, perhaps not even mental power. Pure spiritual inspiration, pure spiritual power. It's one of the most moving events in human history, where a spiritual intervention was needed to save, to protect an entire civilization. It needed an instrument who was open to the spiritual afflatus, having nothing else. Just that was enough to override all other gradations of power and authority and systems and structures. Here we get a glimpse of the greatest power, which is spiritual power. And of course, in passing, I have spoken of mental power, vital power, and physical power. And so we're going to discuss these things a little bit now in detail. What is this spiritual power? And I give one more example, which comes from an example which is reasonably well known in India. There's a famous saint known as Tapasviji Maharaj. That's the name given to him. He lived for many years, I think 180 years or so. And towards the end of his life, there's an incident narrated where he was traveling in a caravan, and at some point they were crossing a river, and his caravan got stuck in the water or in the mud. And everything they did failed. It would just dig deeper into the mud. At some point they asked him, he was sitting inside the caravan, and they asked him, can you please help, because we have failed. We cannot move at all. He walks up to the wheel of the caravan, places a hand on the wheel and says simply, Brahman. And the caravan moves. Pure spiritual power, not even a physical push or a nominal push perhaps. And this is an example of the most extreme kind where pure spiritual power can be isolated from everything else. These are examples to show you, at least as a first step, to get a sense of what is the true nature of power. And it's not enough to just say it is spiritual, because that just puts it to a level of abstraction beyond our comprehension or access. We are going to actually go into detail in defining this. And I want to give one more example, which is from my own life, of how spiritual power works. And the example is precisely to show you that you do not need to be particularly capable or spiritual to be able to receive the action of a spiritual power. I was traveling at that time. I was in a friend's house in their guest room, and it had not been used for a very long time, for many months. And in the bathroom, the knobs for the shower had got a little bit rusted. So I used the shower, I soaped up, and for some odd reason, I turned the knob to see, and click, it went, and the shower stopped, and the water went down. So I said, okay, I'll pull it back. But the knob was rusted. It had just been set for the shower, and I could not pull it back. My hands were wet, soapy. I did everything I could to pull the knob, but it was rusted, it was stuck, and with the best of the physical strength, I could not move it. I was in desperation. I had spent 10 or 15 minutes trying to turn the knob. And I said, I have nothing else left. I'm all soaped up. How do I even get help? And there was no bucket. There was no way to reach the water. The water was just flowing down, and that's it. And I said, whose help can you call at this point? There's only the Divine Mother. And I put my hand on the knob, and I concentrate on the Mother, and I dwell in her consciousness. And at the moment where I forgot myself, the finger just turned, and click, the knob opened. And the water shifted to the shower. I felt no pressure on the finger. I didn't even notice that the hand turned, and click, it was done. But it happened at that moment when I forgot myself and was identified or immersed in the Mother's consciousness. And this is another example of a pure spiritual action. And I show this precisely to point out, you do not need to be specially, endowed with spirituality. What you need is that moment of self-loss in remembrance of the divine, and the divine action can act through you or directly on the situation, bypassing you and your limitations. And that's an example of pure spiritual action on a material circumstance. So all of these will have only set up the base for us to understand and appreciate the true nature of power. Power, as we can now conclude, has nothing to do with material circumstance. It is essentially an energetic, let's say, character or quality which spontaneously compels circumstances to whatever it chooses. It spontaneously overcomes resistance of all kinds, in thought, in emotions, in actions, in matter, even in material circumstances, as we have seen in a few examples. It is something which is in its origin spiritual. And if you go back to the whole hierarchy of planes of consciousness that Sri Aurobindo describes, right at the top is the Sat, that is Chit, that is Ananda. The sheer existence, that is consciousness, that is bliss. And that consciousness has two aspects, Sri Aurobindo explains. When you are aware, what is it that you register in awareness? You know. So knowledge is one aspect. And the second, when you are aware, what is it that you are able to do? Is you are able to increase awareness or modify in awareness your relationship with things. And that is the force aspect. So in the originating, creative consciousness, there is the aspect of knowledge and power. They are basically two sides of the same thing. To our experience, they are split, but in that originating consciousness, what you know is what you become. The knowledge is the power. The power is an expression of what you know, what you are. And so there's no real difference there. But in our human experience, the instruments through which we are able to know are different from the instruments of power. We know through mind, but in order to act, it has to be through life force. And because the instruments are different, the two experiences are different. As a result, there is often a contradiction. I know, but I can't execute. Or I'm compelled to act against my knowledge. And that's where all of our confusion begins. In fact, the biggest difficulty in wielding power effectively is that when you begin to wield it, it wields you rather than you wielding it. If you try to ride power like a horse, the horse, if you amplify its power, it decides where it wants to go. It decides what it wants to do. And you become pretty much carried by it. You may enjoy the ride. You may say, I like the high of power. But power has seized you, not you wielding it. In order to be able to wield it, you must have something more than the power. And the analogy with the horse is perfect. Those of you who have ridden horses, who have been through any kind of training with horses, if you are not in a poise of complete stillness of energy, with the authority of energy upon the horse is going to go wild. It will not obey you. When it senses your authority and accepts, then it will become extremely docile and obedient and even will respond to your thought intentions. If you're afraid, it senses your fear and turns around upon you and seizes the moment and does what it wants. In a way, it reflects your state of consciousness. It requires you to be of a superior grade than it in order for you to be able to wield authority with it. And this is the biggest problem people have when they begin to wield power. They do not realize when the relationship has flipped and they are being wielded and the power is carrying them rather than they carrying the power. And they may still enjoy it. They enjoy the ride, but not realizing that they are victims of the play of power until a mistake happens. Because knowledge is not leading and the power will always make a mistake at that point. So, in order to be able to wield power, we realize that we need to build a sufficiently strong base for being able to wield. And again, we take the model of Sri Aurobindo in the human psychology. We have the physical, vital, and the mental, and then generally the spiritual beyond. We need to build strength in all these. If you really want to be effective in power, just vital power is not enough. So we recognize, and I'm going to dwell upon each of these and describe a little bit of the nature of power in each of these instruments. In the physical body, you need to be strong. If your body is weak and you wield power, your body gets overwhelmed. Even if it is vital power, your body breaks down under the stress of the demand of power. So a strong physical base is absolutely necessary. But there's a certain aspect of physical power which is associated with physical appearance. I'm going to use the word beauty in a very general way. It does not have to be beautiful in a conventional sense, but a certain aesthesis in the physical form is necessary in order to be able to be effective in relationships for execution of power. It's a fact, and this is undeniable, that people who look neat, clean, and reasonably well arranged in their appearance will find others respecting them and relating to them more comfortably than somebody who comes looking disheveled and ugly and crude and coarse. It's a fact. Naturally, a state of beauty, and I use that in a very general sense, a state of beauty would tend to command in a physical form the effective use of power. It's a fact. But the beauty of physical form can also conceal a contrary intention and sometimes even a complete perversion of intention, and there would be no way for you to know if you went only by appearances. And it is the case, in fact, when we go into the subtle worlds, that sometimes the most, because form there is plastic, the most misleading forms may appear to you in a most beautiful way to try to convince you, when in fact what's behind is of a completely different character. But this is just to say that on a physical level, wielding power requires you to take a certain poise of aesthesis in the body. For example, a news reader on television or a presenter of any kind on television, go through a basic makeup. Why? Why not say, I don't care what I look like? Because it's a fact that if the person looks disheveled and ugly, nobody's going to trust what they say. Whereas when they look aesthetic and smart and well-groomed, people will naturally tend to trust them. So this is an aspect of appearance which is necessary for effective use of power on a human level in terms of relationships. But the real sense of power seems to be seated in the vital consciousness. And that's primarily because that aspect of the Chit Shakti, the conscious energy, is represented in the vital consciousness most completely. But here in the vital consciousness, it's represented in a divided state of energies. But you will see those who have a strong vitality have a natural charisma or charm and wield that as their primary means of power. Every politician must have it, otherwise they will not be effective as politicians. They cannot convince people. If you actually sit down and listen to most politicians giving speeches, think about it rationally, you could question almost any statement they make. You will find mostly what they speak has no reason or logic. It's just meant to arouse a crowd, influence them effectively for whatever outcome that they choose. And if they don't have that capacity, well, they just cannot be effective as politicians. I remember an incident which was narrated by the then president of Singapore. He was a devotee of Sri Aurobindo, and he narrated this incident much later after he had left his post. He shared how in the early days when he had just become a politician, he was in a public function and he was giving a speech. There was this huge crowd and he was enjoying the ride of power that he was playing the crowd. And literally, as they say, the crowd laps up from your hands. And it's literally the person is pulling and pushing strings of power and the people are like toys, puppets, responding to those energies. And the speaker feels it. And he was playing this political game. And suddenly he said, as if from above, a voice spoke to him and said, "You really are enjoying this, aren't you?" And he was so shocked. What is this voice? What is this question? Obviously, it was a higher spiritual source which immediately made him realize the futility and the meaninglessness of what he was doing. And it brought such a confusion in his mind. He didn't know what he was doing or why he was doing it. And he began to question that he lost that grip and the whole thing fizzled out. And he came back from the dais and sat down and people around him said, "What happened? You had the crowd lapping up from you and then suddenly you lost them. What happened?" And of course he couldn't explain to them. But this is an example of this vital power wielded. Every successful film actor or actress similarly uses this vital power. Any successful person in life, generally when you say successful, is somebody who has a capacity to wield vital energies to some degree in some form or other. I have another good example I want to share, which is of Marilyn Monroe. She was, of course, as you know, one of the most famous actresses in the United States in that period, with access to the president and all kinds of things, really wielding charisma and charm and power all through. And yet, there's an incident narrated by her friend where the two of them went shopping in a normal shopping mall, and she had put on dark glasses and a scarf, and nobody noticed her. And she was with her friend, they were buying and nobody noticed her. And then she told her friend, "Do you want to see?" And she did not change anything in her physical appearance. She just shook her head slightly and opened herself energetically. And instantly, everybody in the mall began to turn around and look at her and say, "Ah, there's Marilyn Monroe." What she did was literally switch on the charisma, charm, vital energy power and wield it on the people around her. They didn't even have to be looking at her. They were seized by it and made to look and made to recognize and made to adulate. That's the nature of the vital power or vital charisma. So a strong vital is obviously necessary, and if you have the ability to consciously sense and wield, well, that's enough to get you in most places of power or influential positions in the world. Bulk of human power relationships are based purely on this vital, and often a very crude, instinctive vital, but effective and powerful vital. The problem with a strong vital, and if you want to really wield power in a good way, you must have a strong vital. The problem with the strong vital is that it is like the horse. The stronger it is, the more rebellious it tends to be, the more difficult it is to tame it. And so precisely the people who have the greatest capacity to wield vital power are the ones who have the biggest problems in controlling themselves. The power rules them. The power seizes them. They sometimes have strong surges of anger or strong surges of passion or strong emotions of various kinds. They find it difficult to keep the balance of vital energies. Very rarely do you find people who have strong vitality but organized, controlled, stable, based on something deeper, wider and solid. These are the ones who are the most effective, even in the field of vitality. What happens in a typical business meeting, and nobody talks about this, but everyone senses it. Everyone who comes into, let's say, a boardroom meeting, everyone has strong vitals. Otherwise, you're not allowed to go up the chain of the ladder of authority. Everyone comes in with a strong vital. Instantly, as they enter the room, they sense each other's energies. Instantly, they recognize who's the top dog, who are the one or two people who are going to be the strongest in vitality. And instantly, there's an assumption of a hierarchy. You accept to be in an inferior or superior position depending on the balance of vital energies. And the person who's the top dog energetically knows exactly that they are it. And if they sense there's somebody else who's a counter, well, the entire struggle is going to be between them. Before a word is spoken, they know exactly what's going to happen. The bulk of human relationships and power structures are vital based and of this grade only. Not even a higher refined vital in most cases. So I was speaking of this, the problem of the vital charisma or the vital power is that it tends to rule you. It tends to get you carried away. There is connected to this, related to this, something which I would refer to as occult powers. You know, there's a lot of fascination with people having occult powers, and most of these powers have, Sri Aurobindo describes it in three categories: powers of knowledge, powers of action, and powers of being. And again, when we speak of occult powers, generally they represent vital energies and vital powers. Most people live on that domain even when they wield those powers. Not very useful, but it's important to understand. It is very effective. I know of cases, for example, where, and these were businessmen, they were not having enough sales. So they go to some occultist who does a special ritual of invocation of some kind involving a deity, which is of a low grade. And within a few days after that, the person's sales begin to shoot up. And so the person who narrated this to me asked that occultist, "What did you do that made this change?" And he said he does not do it. He has a relationship with the vital being who does it. And the vital being basically feels the alignment of where there's a need and where there is a supply and links the two energetically, and that's what does the thing. But this is just to explain how it happens. It's not such a big deal when you think about it, but these things do exist. They are effective, but they represent power operating at a very coarse level. And one can easily override these powers by a higher grade of power. So now I come to one more grade, which is the mental power. And I will use the word mental fascination to compare it with vital charisma. And occasionally we meet people like this. They are often scholars of some kind or academics. When they come into the room, you don't feel anything of the vitality, nothing of the charisma. But the moment they begin to speak, the clarity and precision of ideas that come and the way they open the whole mental world and the mental experience is so fascinating, it seizes your mind and guides it to whatever it is. The power aspect leads to a mental experience. And so this is of a higher grade of power, not so crudely effective as vital power, but nevertheless very effective in its own domain. And although limited to a mental perspective and so partially effective to that extent, a vital power can override the mental if it was strong enough. All this is to say that the physical, vital, and mental powers are great, or the ability to wield the powers on those levels with a strong base of adhara, strong body, strong vital, strong mind, would be good, would be necessary, but wouldn't be enough. The true power comes on a different level, which has a very different quality. And I'm going to give two examples of this. One we will call, for lack of a better word, psychic power, and the other will be spiritual power. I have one example in mind, but may not be too relevant for most of you in the United States. But if you ever heard of an Indian scientist by the name of Abdul Kalam, very famous in India. He was known as the rocket scientist who created the entire rocket technology. Very humble, very soft-spoken, even a weak physical or a weak vital if you had a first interaction, but not really so. He could be very firm in his intentions, but with a kind of a mental clarity and firmness. He wielded the entire machinery which developed India's space program and missile technologies. And at some point, he was made the president of India, and one of the only presidents that the entire country genuinely respected. And to the end, he was always humble, always genuine. And you could feel in interactions with him something so childlike that you just wanted to open your heart and accept what he said. And this was the character of the psychic power. It is not hard, it is not harsh, it is not compelling. It very gently touches and opens you and spontaneously changes things. I had an experience of this again, which I can share. I was about to take a flight from India to Dubai. And in those days, you needed a particular special stamp on your passport to be able to take a flight to that country, because it was to prevent people from being misused as slave labor. So you had to have a stamp that said you had education of a certain level. And I had not got myself that stamp. So it was a night flight. All the offices were closed. And at the last stage of clearance, the person said, "You don't have the stamp, we can't let you go." He passes us on to the next in command, who says, "Sorry, I don't have the authority. You have to wait till morning when the person with the authority will come." So we pleaded with him, we begged, and nothing worked. And at some point I said, "This is the wrong way. There's no way I can convince him. It's over. The only thing I can do is ask for the mother's help." So very quietly, I let all this go. I said, "Whatever you choose, mother." And I concentrated on the mother's consciousness, simply remembering her and placing the situation in her hands. And then something quite extraordinary happened. The man was speaking and saying, "No, it cannot be done." And his right hand moves spontaneously, opens the drawer, pulls out a rubber stamp, and he's still saying, "No, it cannot be done. It's not possible." And then he opens the rubber stamp box, stamps my passport, and gives it back and says, "No, it cannot be done." It was amazing to see. It was literally as if he does not want to, but his hand is magically compelled to just do what's needed, and the work was done. And I profusely thanked him, and more than that, thanked the mother. And it was so sweetly, softly, effortlessly done. And you could see it was purely an intervention of a higher kind, but there was no sense of power, no sense of compulsion, just a soft, smooth, direct flow. And this I can only describe as a psychic power. Spiritual power has a different character. It can be dramatic, it can be intense, but it is so spontaneous as to be obvious. There could have been no other way. And Joan of Arc would be a good example. When she convinced you, that's it. There couldn't be any other way. She has to be right, and it had to work. There's no other choice. And it acts on a wide scale. It acts with a spontaneity also, but it is obvious in the way it acts. In its origin, as I said, spiritual power is Chit Shakti, consciousness force. But as from that source, it begins to act through various levels, layer by layer, through various aspects, fragments. What you end up is, from the ocean, rivers, from rivers, streams, from streams, little brooks, from brooks, little puddles and ponds and drops. Until it comes to a certain level of divided mind, life, and body, where we catch either one stream or one drop or a little cluster of the power content and play with it and wield it. Because our consciousness is finite, we have a finite cup, we can only scoop out a cupful. Our ego sense, which is a division of consciousness, seizes upon that which is a continuum for the divine creative consciousness, cuts it up to a limited flow, and the moment you have limited power, even if it's great, even if it's intense, it's limited, there is another power stream which is contrary to this. And so in the domain of mind, life, and matter, any power wielded will act against another power stream. There is always opposition at the level of power. You can never have power which is spontaneously smooth in its effectivity because it's fragmented. And we have to understand this is very important. The moment you wield power with your ego sense, which is a divided consciousness, there will be a conflicting power position that you do not wield. Therefore, there will be opposition against which you have to struggle and assert power. Therefore, there will be increasing conflict, increasing opposition because of the reaction of your effort, and often in proportion to your effort. And therefore, even if you seem to win in the short term, eventually the reactions, the side effects will ripple out and end up in a frustration or an eventual failure of some kind. You can say, yes, I did great work, but it lasted 2 or 3 years or 10 years. And after that, all kinds of forces came and fizzled out, broke the work. Why? Precisely because all those forces had been evoked in a reaction to my forceful action. But when the spiritual power acts from the source, the spirit is one, infinite, indivisible. And so its action is also multifaceted, multifold, simultaneously from all directions. The natural station of the spirit's creative power is what Sri Aurobindo calls the supramental. And so in the supramental consciousness, all is included, all viewpoints, all aspects, all streams. So when it acts, let's say for a particular purpose, even the opposing forces or the opposing positions are included in its scope. It knows them, it understands them, and can wield them also. And so to the supramental power's effectivity, there is nothing which is contrary. There is nothing which is opposing. Even what may come as an appearance of opposition is used by it to amplify its outcome and even to speed it up or make more perfect. And so the true sense of power is spiritual, precisely because it faces no opposition. When the divine consciousness in its creative movement wields true power, there is no other. All is divine consciousness, all is itself. And so when it acts, its action is effortless because there is nothing other to oppose it. All else is itself. And so all cooperates, all collaborates. The streaming of power is flowing, laminar, with no contradiction. It is effortless, because no opposition. It is flawless because it can do exactly what it wants to the tiniest detail. It is reactionless because there's nothing pushing back. It is perfect and it is complete. All power is originally the one divine power, effortless, flawless, reactionless, perfect, complete. It's only when it begins to act through media which are fragmented that we experience fragmentation and therefore conflict, opposition, and frustration of power. And then the preparation for us becomes obvious. The more we are able to open to that grade of consciousness and act from it, the more we are able to wield or share in the true effective power without contradiction, without conflict, and without frustration. You need to open to a consciousness of infinity. And naturally, with consciousness of infinity, you will have to open to knowledge, which is infinite. And with it will come spontaneously the effective power that is infinite. And you will need one more thing, which is a love that is infinite. Because all these are the natural status of that creative consciousness. I'm going to read a few lines from Sri Aurobindo when he describes this original creative power, and just get the sense of it when he describes, and look at it from the aspect of the creative power aspect. The one original transcendent Shakti, the mother, stands above all the worlds and bears in her eternal consciousness the supreme divine. Alone, she harbors the absolute power and the ineffable presence, containing or calling the truths that have to be, brings them down from the mystery in which they were hidden into the light of her infinite consciousness, and gives them a form of force in her omnipotent power and her boundless life and a body in the universe. See, this movement, which translates all possibilities in her omnipotent power, in a boundless life and a body, that is the. And there we get the sense of the true nature of power and its origin. Well, once we accept there's only one power, we may of course focus on limitation aspects of that power. Sri Aurobindo speaks of 4 aspects of the Divine Mother. There is Maheshwari, Mahakali, Mahalakshmi, and Mahasaraswati. And while we may say Mahakali is the aspect of power, generally yes, but Maheshwari also has power of knowledge. Mahalakshmi also has power of love. Mahasaraswati has power of precision and perfection. Power is always and everywhere. But Mahakali especially, so to say, embodies that aspect which is the force and strength which comes with the power, with the creative power. And through, thereafter, on all levels, there's a reflection of these powers and their aspects, and in various forms, various specializations, various limitations, all the way down to the most material. Where in material form, power is bound to an object or a force or a measure of quantity or a position or a chair. At least it's associated with, although not bound essentially. And so this gives you a full picture of the sense of streaming power. If you wish to be a wielder of power and true power, then as we have seen, we have to build your physical base, vital base and mental base. But more than anything else, you have to be able to open out to become an instrument for the spiritual power. And the spiritual power can override all other powers. There's an example which took place in the ashram in the early days where there was a cook who was dismissed, I think, and he swore revenge, went to a black magician, and the black magician said, for whom? And they said, I want it against Sri Aurobindo. And he said, no, I cannot. That is a spiritual man. The power will rebound on me. But what I can do is I can attack the things around in the house, but not him directly. So as it happened, they did some thing. There were some marks on the wall and stones began to fall. And many of you would know the story. And the mother came and reported it to Sri Aurobindo. And Sri Aurobindo just nodded, and immediately the phenomenon stopped. A few days later, the wife of the black magician came to Sri Aurobindo begging forgiveness, saying that her husband was in the hospital dying. Sri Aurobindo said, "Oh, all for a few stones." And that was it. He was out of his danger. But this is to say that for a spiritual consciousness, you can throw at it anything. And it is an all-inclusive consciousness. Nothing can break, nothing can affect, nothing can counter it, and effortlessly. And this is well known to people who deal with lesser powers and lesser energies. Well, the question for us is this. If you want to truly be able to wield power, you have to open to a spiritual consciousness, and yet you have a conflict. You say, I want a specific outcome, and you're telling me to become egoless and open to spiritual consciousness. What's the point of wielding power, right? Or maybe on a higher grade, you'll say, I want to serve a higher purpose. But for that, I have to be participating. I have to make an effort, isn't it? So, yes, it's true. Your ego will be a starting point to wield power, but your ego can start by becoming a servant, deliberately, consciously, giving itself. It can start by building a base which is aligned to the higher purpose. And while it may still have its own ideas of what needs to be done, the right attitude would be to say, here is the outcome to the best of my understanding. Show me if you will choose a better outcome or a different outcome. And as you make the effort, you say, I put my best, I offer my efforts to you, Divine Mother, and whatever the outcome, I will accept. And in this attitude, one begins to engage. If we have not limited ourselves to the work aspect, but also worked on purifying our mind and why.
Well, well, well. We have lost him once again. Oh dear. Let me try one more time. And I'll just try calling him too, just in case. Hold that thought, everyone. Let's see if we can get him back.
It is quite interesting, actually, this description of the power from the highest source to the smallest streams, because it corresponds exactly to the vision of tantric vision of Pashyanti, Mahapashyanti, smaller Pashyanti. There are intentions which are coming from the higher stream and then becoming smaller and smaller streams in action upon earth. Yes, here we are divided. We know that this action is to be done against some other action, but we do not see the action which embodies both, holds both. So it's the higher kind of intention, and there is even higher and higher, and until you come to the top, and from the top you see one vision of all the actions together. And that kind of consciousness he is referring to. It's quite beautiful.
So, you know, the vision I got when he was mentioning this you know, this river and stream and puddles was the Ganga, right, flowing down onto Shiva's head and into Shiva's head. So this higher consciousness of and power, really, right? That's what Ganga represents, is the consciousness or the power of the consciousness flowing into Shiva. Directly into his head. So activating Shiva, who is the being consciousness, right?
Well, she was quite naughty there. She thought that she would smash Shiva now. And then Shiva understood this when she was flying with this thought. He caught her thought. And then what he did, he let her come down and get lost in his hair. She got lost in his hair. This is the spiritual power absorbing any other action of consciousness, yeah, which can find its place there forever. Until she was released, because Bhagirath went around and finally he released her with his tapasya of 1,000 years, begging Shiva to release the Ganga. Quite interesting story.
Here comes Shudalu again. So sorry all for this kind of broken. What we will do is, because we're recording, we'll cut those places where we lost them and put back together a seamless talk here for you all
Okay, I'm
to
back.
listen to.
I don't know
There he
where
is again.
I lost you. What was the last thing I said?
It was really opening up to the
Okay.
higher.
Okay. Yes. And that's it. So I said this is the only way, this is the best way for us who are students and disciples of the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo to develop our capacity to wield knowledge, power, and love of the divine in service to the divine. That's all. So I hope I have been broad enough, and I apologize for the interruptions. But if I've been broad enough in scope, we can take up any comments or questions.
Great, thank you, Shudalu. So yes, any questions and or comments, we would just ask you to unmute yourself. And if you're comfortable, also have your video on. If not, that's fine. Any questions and or comments?
Dolores here. I just really want to point to an amazing presentation, Shraddha, that you all introduced about the devotion to the Divine Mother and how everything kind of leads to that, and how you just basically guide us to higher and higher opening. And it's just so beautiful how such a complex material from Sri Aurobindo suddenly just has this life. I mean, literally, you explaining to the levels that we're all so excited about, be part of today's talk, and basically kind of underline all of this, just continuous aspiration for her to guide us, as you mentioned your incident in the airport, right? Just kind of open up and be really receptive to her. And that's basically going to be the first step, and so many steps. And another observation, as I'm reading Savitri, it's kind of endless, immortal, and completely different perspective for everybody. And it's just kind of underlies how he wrote that. And it's infinite, truly, honestly, when you read that, and every time you read that again, it's infinite and kind of underlies his consciousness. So I just really want to thank you for all spread of your teaching and light and power, and just to know how powerless we are, and this amazing ocean of the wisdom. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
May I ask a silly question? I want to ask, after hearing this, I want to know, why is everybody aiming, chasing, wanting, craving, working for power then? I mean, why the whole power games, like, why?
It's because it is one of the aspects of the divine manifestation's fulfillment. It is the aspect that gives you the capacity to be effective in the world. It's not enough to know. You should be able to translate that knowledge into energetic, dynamic action to manifest what you know. And this power aspect is the aspect of consciousness that actualizes. But as I said earlier, in the physical domain, in the consciousness in which we live, power are split. When we act from a higher status of consciousness, what we are becomes spontaneously. And that's the way the self acts. But here we have to make that effort. And so the struggle to assert, to make real what we know should be or what we would want to be, is that struggle for the power. But the moment everybody is in a fragment looking for a piece of a larger truth and asserting a tiny piece of it against another piece. You have a scramble for power. And it is the scramble which you're describing and saying why. In each one of us, there is a natural alignment to one of these four aspects of the Divine Mother: knowledge, power, harmony, and perfection. And we tend to perceive that as more important. So those of us who are more aligned to knowledge will say, I don't care about power. I would rather know. But then you're ineffective. Those of you who are drawn to power will say, I don't care with his theories. I just want to be able to do and get it done. And there's somebody else who will say, but I don't care about how good, how effective it is or how famous it is. I want it to be beautiful. I want it to be perfect, or I want to just be of service. It will take some other form according to your temperament. But the fact is, if you remove the aspect of power, nothing would ever get done, at least to effectivity. And so, yes, it's a natural instinct for us to want to be effective. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just we have to understand the true nature of power and then be able to be effective in the right way, the maximally effective.
And to that extent, can I ask another question? Is it possible for us in this life now to express the full powers in the same body, in the same aim?
Absolutely, why not? Where is the doubt? Because you think it will take time? It should take 400 years, so 4 lives? Yes, it would if you didn't do much, but if you did what was necessary, or if you aligned yourself to the action of the divine Shakti, then for her it can be done within a few very short time, well within the human lifespan. I'm sorry, I don't know where it cut off when I was speaking to.
I think you were just finished answering
Okay.
Dolores's question.
Fine.
So,
Okay.
or did he? Yeah, he did. Dolores, you felt he completed your question on if we could
Okay.
embody all 4 in this.
Yes. Okay. That's
that
fine.
encouragement of saying, what doubts do you have? I mean, just continue, and you can see that. So thank you so much.
Shraddhalu, I had a question regarding the 4 powers of the mother. Don't you think that we manifest in a small way all the 4 powers at different periods of time?
In fact, all 4 powers are simultaneously present in any effective action. If they were not there, you would not be able to have an effective action. It's only that these 4 are not equally developed and not equally integrated, and that makes for the ineffectivity or less effectivity of your action. So we make the separation of the 4 only for purpose of understanding. In fact, they're always present simultaneously, each mutually supporting each other. And the more we are open to the action of all 4 fully integrated, the more effective our results.
So when you say when we are fully open, do you mean that we should be conscious? Does that mean that there should be consciousness that now this is the power, this aspect of the mother is coming through me? I mean, what does it mean to be?
No, because you can't always distinguish, because the 4 are so deeply intermingled. Each time you act, for example, you are about to arrange your room. There's an aspect of knowledge. There's an aspect which translates the knowledge into power. There's an aspect which places all the things in right harmony. And then there's the aspect which makes perfect in the tiny detail. Can you ever separate them? You can't.
No, yes.
So I would suggest not to focus too much on trying to separate them, rather be open in a way that is complete to the inspiration of the divine consciousness, that she can pour through you and wield all aspects, not just these 4, including all else, in a smooth flow, which is all inclusive. That should be our primary effort. And then you will notice that in you, certain aspects are stronger. For some people, the knowledge aspect will be stronger. And then the harmony aspect is not very well developed. And then you may work to develop that as a skill.
I see.
But there's no need to analyze too much. Rather, you see where there's a lack, You feel the inspiration come, but you're unable to complete the aspect of the harmony of arrangement or the beauty of the arrangement. And you notice it and you work to develop it. That's all.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments from the group? I know, Shadalu, you use the word power most of the time, but every now and then you reference force.
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain the difference between force and
Yes.
power, if there is a difference?
Yes. The force is a more generic way of describing it, that there is a certain pressure which compels. Power is when that force is gathered to a specific outcome. And that's when we would give it a more obvious form and say, this is a center of power or an action of a certain power. But force is a more generic sense because it acts in every way, in all directions as necessary.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any other comments, questions before we lose Shadalu again?
I'll have one. Oh, good.
Oh, good. Bob, did you have, or Don did? Okay, go ahead, Don.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Shwadalu, I loved the way you just brought together, you presented an integral description of those four aspects of knowledge, power, and so on. And I appreciate in the beginning, I love the way, I think as a teaching device, you really described the extremes of vital or the mental without the vital. But I especially really appreciated the fact, I mentioned when you were off for a minute that I noticed playing classical music, that all those different qualities came and went in different ways. And I also loved when you're saying something as simple, again, something practical we all can see, that just in organizing the room, not that you're conscious of it mentally, but you can feel like you're feeling music or feeling qualities of consciousness. You can feel all those aspects in a play the mind can't begin to comprehend. You describe so beautifully, of course, it's always happening with one aspect more or less prominent. It was very much appreciated.
Thank you.
I think, Bob, did you have something you wanted to say?
Similar to what Don said, but less detailed and powerful. But I really like the way, am I saying your name correctly, Shudahu?
That's fine.
Okay. I like his descriptions to us as we being non-Indian, most of us, not all of us, but I strongly sense the differences in the cultures, and I think it's hard to say because it's hard to bring my feelings and thoughts together. But when Shudalu says something, it seems to me, yeah, of course it's that way. I already knew that, but there is no way I could have said it. I couldn't even have formed the thoughts. So I really appreciate that. I'm not quite sure how it happens or why it happens. I think it has something to do with cultures. And I also, when I'm experiencing this, and as I'm telling it to you, I realize there's no need for me to worry about that. He has the way of saying it so that I can understand it. I can see that it's true, but it is inside of me. So I don't need to worry about the future. He won't be here, but in some sense, he will be here because that aspect that he's invoking is already there. I really like that.
Thank you. In my teacher training programs, I highlight this aspect of knowledge. The true knowledge is true knowledge is transmitted when you feel, yes, it's obvious because I already knew it somewhere inside. And the interaction only assisted in awakening what I already knew. And when that has happened, it's yours, it's your knowledge. It's not something you learned from someone. You uncovered what you already knew, and you will never lose it. And more than information, which is what you have remembered from elsewhere, which can be lost, this is what you live because you are already it. And that's why it's so important.
I would have some question. How is it how to activate the higher consciousness if one is in a situation where several persons are involved and one has to decide also that not one person crashes, or be sure that one is connected to the higher consciousness. And sometimes the impression is there, one has to make maybe several efforts in that direction, or is there any experience in that regard?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Normally you will find when you are in the situation with people, it will be very difficult for you to make a special effort to open to a higher state. The thing to do is to do it beforehand. So before you go to the meeting, you concentrate, center yourself consciously in whatever way you feel most helpful, open to the mother's presence and call for her help. Now there are two different things, opening and calling. You may call, but if you're still closed, you don't receive. You may open, but without an aspiration, then the response is generally not effective. So you open and call for help. And if there's a specific purpose for the meeting, you may say, here, this meeting is for this particular outcome. And I ask for your knowledge, for your guidance, your strength, your harmony to make it effective, to make it successful. So you make that call before you go, put yourself in as deep or high a state as you can, and then enter the domain. During the interactions, you may or may not lose your poise. And if you feel you have lost your poise, you take a pause, disengage, remember the earlier concentration, once again invoke the help, and then re-engage as necessary. But the key is to set yourself beforehand so that during the activity, you already have the necessary base. And I would suggest at the end of it also similarly, you make a closure, offering the efforts made and asking for the right guidance for the effectivity. If you're not the only person who has a spiritual opening, then have everybody in the meeting begin the meeting with this concentration, that you sit together, let's all concentrate to invoke the divine help and guidance for this work which we have to do together. And similarly, at closure time, you again close with an invocation for help and guidance.
Yes, yes, I understand, and I try also, but also in case of deciding what is right, or to have really the right idea, or
when you have to make a decision.
Yes.
So if at that point you are in a state of receptivity, you will often get a certain suggestion. And for that, again, you have to do a prior training. And the most important training is, or in the preparation, is to remove from yourself all personal preferences and likes and dislikes for the outcome. To have no bias, so that whatever comes as a guidance, you will be able to receive as purely as possible. As long as you have a personal bias, expectation, or preference, you will not be able to receive with clarity the right action. So this is part of the training to make yourself completely clear like a slate, and then wait with a call for the right guidance. Again, you do this ideally beforehand so that you enter the meeting with already a certain state of alignment. If you cannot, for whatever reason, then you take a decision which allows the maximum adaptation later on. So we are all agreed that this is the general outcome we want. Since we don't know exactly how we are going to do it, let's take steps which keep all our options open so that we may adjust as we go along. And then you wait for the guidance with each step that you take in the effort. You wait for the right feel, and you will sometimes feel, yes, this feels right. Sometimes you'll feel, no, something is missing, and you'll step back and find a deeper insight. So, and if there's no time, you just have to take a decision. You take the decision which is the most practical. And that's it. The point is, at each moment, you act from the poise available, the highest poise available to you. If you don't have an opening to higher intuition, at least you have an opening to higher reason. Use your higher reason. But waiting still for the higher intuition, which will confirm it or correct it. But always act from your highest available at that moment.
Okay. Thank you. Yes.
Veronica, I see your mic open. Did you have a question or comment for Shadalu?
Yeah, I just cannot help but sharing this. I loved your story of the stamp on the passport, because years ago I was in India and I needed my visa to be renewed. So I said, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And I just put a photo Shurabindu and the mother inside my passport and handed the passport to the man. So he looked at me, smiled, stamp. So it works. It works. So thank you so much. I will remember both stories and use them. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
But sometimes it works the other way around. You put your passport as I did, and they said no entry to India, prohibited. And I'm cast out of India, from Auroville, from everywhere. And then I arrive at La Grasse, and I'm given the whole house and place and work and all the best connections and time. And everything, new window, new door, new land, new life is opening. Through very narrow, very painful passage, which I couldn't recognize that time, and complained. It's something similar as Sri Aurobindo complained in Udaipur jail, to Krishna. Why did you bring me here? And Krishna says, I wanted to have some time with you. You didn't have time for me. Well, too busy. So something similar may happen. So one has to be open, as Shraddha says, to see what is the highest.
Sri Aurobindo makes this observation that all that happens does not necessarily happen for the best. But having happened, the divine will make the best use of it.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, if we open ourselves to the divine help.
Thank you. Well, Shadalu, again, thank you so much for staying with us and for joining repeatedly, given the internet issues, and for everybody on this Sunday morning here and evening elsewhere for staying with us. We so very much appreciate, and we will be, I was mentioning, Shadalu, we're going to slice this recording so that we just kind of get your parts in and redistribute it to everyone. So thank you all again, and we'll see you next Sunday. Namaste.
Thank you. Namaste. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.